Everyone, welcome to our webinar this afternoon in the 2021 webinar series, Co-Requisites that Support Partner Disciplines, with Chris Orline. This webinar is co-sponsored by the National Math Summit, AMATYC, and the MAA. Any views expressed by the presenter are not necessarily the views of AMATYC, and any commercial products mentioned are not endorsed by AMATYC. We want to thank McGraw-Hill as the sponsor of this year's webinar series. If you are not a member of AMATYC, we would love to have you as a member. Please consider joining at our website. We also have a presence on Facebook with many opportunities for interaction. Upcoming professional development opportunities, the conference in Phoenix. Last I heard, it will be live in Phoenix. Next year, Toronto. There are other traveling workshops and webinar opportunities throughout the year. And any results from this or past webinars can be found at our webinar page of the AMATYC website. All right, so I will stop sharing, and Chris, I will turn it over to you.
All right. All right, so we're going to talk about co-requisites a little bit. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to do a poll. And the question you're going to answer is, after taking your math course, are your students prepared for following courses with significant computational or symbolic components? And your choices are yes, no, or you haven't thought about it. So let's give people, let's say, a minute to give their answer in, Pat. Okay. So everyone, I'm guessing, was pretty honest about that. 3 yeses, 3 nos, and 1 haven't thought about it. Okay. Second question. I just want you to type your answer in the chat, but don't hit enter yet. What one skill or topic or objective has been lost in your transition from your developmental sequence to co-requisites that could help your students beyond their gateway math courses? So what have we lost that could be helping students in courses after they're done with their math courses? Take about 30 seconds to type it in the chat. All right, now everybody hit enter. So we're seeing some consistency, some basic algebra skills, a lot of critical thinking, unit conversions, proportional reasoning. Okay. So y'all are thinking about things in ways I think that are good. So what's going on here? So this is a quote from a report that came out a couple of years ago from Tennessee, which was kind of one of the leaders in the co-rec movement early on. After they had done co-requisites for about 3 years, they did not find any significant effects of co-requisite remediation on enrollment persistence, transfer to four-year colleges, or degree completion up to 3 years after initial enrollment. This suggests that improvements in gateway course outcomes are important, but insufficient barometers of academic momentum and college success. So we are doing a good job as we implement co-requisite reform in getting students to and through our gateway math courses. But it doesn't seem to be having an effect long-term on things that we hoped getting students through their gateway math course would have an effect on: persistence, transfer, degree completion, right? Math was the roadblock. Getting through the long developmental sequence and then a college math course that may or may not have been relevant. That was all part of the roadblock to students finishing their degrees. Well, now we've instituted pathways, trying to get students in the right math course. And we've instituted some sort of reform with our support system, shortening our developmental sequences and instituting co-requisites. And we're getting students where they need to be as far as math goes, but something's still not happening beyond the math class, which leads us to the key question. What can we do in our gateway courses and the co-requisite supports to contribute to improving persistence and degree completion? We know we can't solve the problem all by ourselves. There are advising components. There are issues having to do with student life outside of the classroom. But what can we do in our courses and in our supports to contribute to improving persistence and degree completion? Well, there are a couple of things that people have already proposed as answers. One is even more deliberate use of the math pathways. And there's a lot going on to get faculty talking to advisors and to get two-year college faculty talking to four-year college faculty to try to improve all of those math pathways, have students better advised, and get them in the right math courses. The other thing that's been proposed is let's infuse study skills and life skills into the gateway courses and their co-requisites. A lot of us were moving towards this in our developmental sequences. So it's been proposed, and there have been lots of other talks and webinars done about putting study skills back into some of our courses. And I won't talk about that today. You can go find, and I would encourage you to go find some of the material out there. People are working on this. What I want to focus on is content. What content is needed in courses and programs beyond the Gateway Math course that we can teach in our courses and our co-requisites that maybe we've forgotten about, or maybe we didn't give a whole lot of attention to previously because it wasn't something that was needed immediately in that college algebra course that we had everybody taking. So that's what we want to look at. Where is that content? What is that content? How might we present and engage students with that content? So let's start with thinking about something that seems kind of simple and something that maybe we don't do a lot of or enough of anyway, and that's reading charts and tables. So when I think of charts and tables, the place I think about these are in quantitative reasoning pathways, maybe an intro stats pathway, and also occasionally maybe some sort of modeling pathway for business or life science or some social sciences, where we do a little bit of algebra and a little bit of data. But what I want to say is reading charts and tables is for everybody. Let's not leave out our science engineering pathway. There's a lot of things that our science and engineering majors do that are not algebraic or calculus kind of computation. A lot of it is reading things off of charts and tables, interpreting what that information is telling them, and putting them into the format that they need to solve problems. But one thing that we do not do in a lot of our math classes is allow our students to just explore things. Right? The typical statistics or quantitative reasoning textbook gives students a pie chart, a bar chart, a table with data, and starts asking them questions that involve calculating stuff. That's too quick. A lot of times it's anxiety creating for our students. They haven't had time to take in what is presented to them. A lot of times it's also affirming what they believe about mathematics, that math is all about solving or calculating stuff. And there's not any creativity, there's not any wonder to mathematics. So when you give your students charts and tables to look at, give them time to explore that chart or that table or that graph as a model. You might have to ask them guiding questions, but give them a chance to notice things. Give them a chance to ask questions themselves. Maybe you're giving them something about probability and there are missing numbers. Eventually you're going to ask them about those missing numbers. They may want to wonder why they're missing or what they represent. Ask them to find patterns. Ask them to find places where there aren't patterns, where it seems haphazard or random. All sorts of questions where they just explore and they don't do any calculating or solving. So they get comfortable looking at the model and interacting with the model. They may then generate questions you don't anticipate, questions you wouldn't even think are questions about a pie chart or a bar chart or a table of data. Some questions you could then ask that don't involve them calculating a lot of things. Make sure they know what the units of measurement are. Make sure they understand why would we measure whatever it is with that unit of measurement. Some of our students don't have very good intuition about when we're measuring area, when we're measuring volume, when we're measuring temperature, things like that. They just assume all temperatures being measured in degrees Fahrenheit. So you might have to talk about conversions. Our students are still not as proficient with the metric system as we'd like them to be. So you might have to take some time and lead them through some things about millimeters, centimeters, meters, for example, right? Take time for them to explore those things. And I think something that we've lost in focusing on just-in-time remediation in our co-requisites, especially in courses that still have an algebra feel to them. I don't think we spend enough time talking about ratios and percentages. In some cases, calculating a very simple percentage for our students is a difficult task. It takes them a long time to process how to do that calculation. One reason is because they're just not comfortable, right? We lose a lot of students, we know, when they get introduced to fractions and decimals and percentages. The second reason that they're not as good with percentages as we expect them to be is that they're used to just memorizing things and they get formulas mixed up and procedures backwards. They don't have a good sense for what a percentage is measuring or what a ratio is measuring. So we need to do a lot more work with ratios, percentages. In the chat, a couple of you mentioned proportional reasoning and unit conversions, and those are all related with ratios and percentages and changes. One of the things our students are going to have to do when they go take science courses, and they all have to take something, and a lot of our health profession students have to take chemistry. They do a lot in their labs of calculating percent changes. How did some amount increase? By what percent did something increase when we changed these parameters? Or we took one measurement and then we took a second measurement. What's the percent difference in those measurements? Those are difficult things for our students to do, to write those lab reports, and they're not things we've traditionally spent a lot of time on in our developmental sequences, and now even less in our co-requisites. And I have to be honest, before I kind of investigated what went on in a physical science course, I'm not sure I could have told you the difference between percent increase, decrease problems and just overall percent difference. It's not something I had thought about probably since I took my college science and lab courses. That when you measure the percent difference, you have two measurements. You don't really have a base that you're starting from. So they have to understand absolute value, and they have to understand the average between the two measurements. So that adds some complication to what they're doing. And if all they're doing is memorizing formulas and they're not gaining an intuition for what they're measuring, that causes them problems later on. So let's talk about a little more in depth these kinds of things: fractions, decimals, percents, and rates. Like I said, studies have shown, you can go look at it. Where do we lose students? Even as kids, they like math, they love math, they're good at calculating things. Then somewhere around the 4th grade, they're slammed with fractions and decimals, and we lose them because it creates anxiety. It's procedures that don't make sense. And then maybe they get through that, and then somewhere in the 5th, 6th, 7th grade, we start hitting them with percent calculations. And then when they start doing algebra, we introduce the idea of slope as this thing on a graph, and the only thing they ever remember is rise over run, and they've never really thought about what is it they're really calculating, doing all of this stuff. And we've got to fix it now. And notice here I said every student. Sometimes I think we get in this thought process that the students who are in our science and engineering pathway, who take pre-calculus and then trig, and then our calculus courses, are all comfortable with what we would call these basic arithmetic skills. We find out when we talk to our colleagues who teach physics and engineering and chemistry that it doesn't matter what pathway that student's in or what program that student's in. Percentages and rates cause them lots of trouble. So how do we address some of this? Well, the first thing is we need to be more deliberate as math professors in providing more problems that we present to students and that we have students work that have actual units of measurement in them. Right? It's good to talk sometimes abstractly about the equation of a line and slope, but we need to do a lot more with problems that have actual units of measurement on them, and problems that don't involve y's and x's as much. Get our students used to different variables representing different units of measurement so that when they give answers, they can write those answers out using those units of measurement and referring to those units of measurement. I think the other thing we need to do, especially in our co-requisite situations, is guide our students through the procedure, even something we might think as simple as just calculating a percentage. give them questions that take them through step by step the procedure so that they see what the pieces are of solving the problem rather than just showing them example after example of how to calculate a percentage or how to turn a decimal into a percent or things like that. Ask them guided questions to lead them through it. Have them show us and show each other and explain to us, explain to each other how they're calculating things. Because then they will catch those careless errors. Right? Even students I've had who've had calculus and are now taking an engineering physics course will calculate a percent and by flipping the fraction the wrong way. And they don't think to check their answer, or they don't think to wonder if their answer makes sense. Such as, when is it okay to get an answer of over 100%? Sometimes if I'm doing a percent increase problem, I might increase by more than 100%. But if I'm calculating some percentage of a whole, I better not get over 100%. But if they flip their fraction that they then turn into a decimal, sometimes they don't think to go ahead and convert it to a percent and check and think, hey, I can't get 3,000% as my answer. Let me go back and figure out what I did wrong. So maybe if we guide them through some, asking them questions as they work it with us and with each other, maybe they'll catch those things and they'll start developing some intuition. I already mentioned this once, but this is a source of a lot of issues for students as they move ahead in their science courses and somewhat in economics and finance kinds of courses. Students just want to memorize procedure. So when they have to calculate a percent increase or decrease, they get that mixed up with calculating a percent difference between two measurements. To them, the formulas look so much the same, it's easy for their brain to flip things. So we need to teach them and work with them on slowing down their minds, rephrasing the question. What are we calculating? What do we have as information to do those calculations? With a percent difference, you have two measurements. With a percent increase or decrease, you have a base. It could be a measurement, but you have a base value that you're starting with, and you're comparing that as it increased or decreased to something. With a percent difference, you just want to know as a percentage how far apart they are. So explain to them or lead them through with guided questions that they have an absolute value and why they have an absolute value and why you might divide by the average of the two. Whereas with a percent increase or decrease problem, you're dividing by wherever you started. Try to develop that intuition as best you can. Now, when it comes to rates, what are they asked to do? And I hear a lot about rates and proportional reasoning from my colleagues in health professions, particularly as we've gone away from having our students take a lot of developmental mathematics, where a lot of our basic proportional reasoning and unit conversions were covered and practiced were in our zero level college prep math courses. And so now we have students going into the health professions and they haven't practiced as much with some of these kinds of problems. They do a lot of unit conversion. Our health profession students take chemistry. Chemistry bombards them with unit conversions. And then in their chemistry classes and a lot of times in their health professions classes, they have to use proportional reasoning. They have to think about how much medication to give a patient based on some measurement about that patient, height, weight, body mass index, something like that. And they have to convert milligrams to how many pills for kind of their basic measurement, and then convert that to whatever the measurement is about the particular person. And so there's kind of a double layer proportional reasoning that might also include unit conversions. So it's a very in-depth problem solving and critical thinking problem for them. And we've just, in some ways, given up teaching about proportional reasoning because it's not something that necessarily comes up directly in our gateway math courses. But where we could benefit from including this in the gateway math courses is that if we do a good job teaching proportional reasoning in the co-req, it sets our students up to better understand geometric growth and exponential change, exponential growth and decay, which can ultimately then help them understand logarithmic scales in a more applied pathway. We wouldn't think of it as understanding logarithmic functions, but definitely logarithmic scales. And then in the science and engineering pathway, they really do have to understand those logarithmic scales, because all of my engineering students still walk around with that engineering paper where they're doing all those log and semi-log graphs. So I kept a special category just for decimals. And why do I have rules of exponents here with decimals? So one of the things that we used to do in developmental math, we've spent a lot of time on rules of exponents. We would develop them all. We might even, some of us, try to prove in some way to our developmental students why those rules of exponents worked, why negative exponents meant things went in denominators, why fractional exponents meant roots. And to our students, it was all just, okay, just tell me what to do because I don't really care why it works. So why are rules of exponents related to decimals? And why should this be how we approach rules of exponents? And the big key when we're thinking about our students moving on in science or in economics or finance is scientific notation. So in our traditional developmental courses, we would spend a lot of time on rules of exponents and then a lot of time on these exercises applying rules of exponents with ridiculously hard problems just to make students think their way through all the different rules of exponents that they could apply. And we convinced ourselves these were good problems because we said they were critical thinking problems. They had to lay out a strategy, which rules they had to use in which order. And then we would spend one day, if even one full day, on scientific notation. We introduced scientific notation and then a little bit on how to multiply two different numbers in scientific notation or divide them and move the decimal around a little bit. When in reality, we should have been spending a lot more time on scientific notation. And so again, when I'm talking about teaching this in the co-req, let's be deliberate. Let's allow students to actually explore the notation, not just tell them what it is. Give them different numbers in scientific notation and have them explore what makes a number large, what makes a number very small. What do the different pieces in the scientific notation mean? What is that negative exponent and how is it related to powers of 10? Because now you can really talk about calculating things and moving decimal points. But a lot of times, as I've mentioned already, we don't give our students time to explore. Think of the scientific notation itself, a number or a set of numbers represented in scientific notation, as a model for our students to explore. And once they've explored that model, once they've explored that notation, now you can start talking about doing calculations. What happens when I try to add two numbers that are in scientific notation? Multiply two numbers, divide. And then if I need to represent the answer back in scientific notation, how do I start moving the decimal? Why do I need to move the decimal sometimes and not move the decimal other times? Try to develop more than just procedure memorization as much as you can. Why is scientific notation so important? Because in a lot of their science classes, our students have to use significant figures when they report their answers. So the basic idea I try to explain to my students when they ask me about significant figures is, first of all, you don't want to report a measurement or an answer to a calculation with any more accuracy than data you were given. You can't calculate something to more precision than the way it was given to you. And they memorize all these different rules about significant figures, especially things having to do with zeros. If a zero's here, it's part of the significant figure. If the zero's here, it's not. But if we were to reduce it down, significant figures are really just asking you how many digits are you going to use if you report this number in scientific notation. Then you know what the zeros do. If you had to add zeros to get those number of significant figures, they count. If there's zeros before a decimal place, they might not count. And if you're using true scientific notation, you probably shouldn't have any zeros before that decimal place unless you're fudging some things somewhere. So if we teach them good scientific notation practices, significant figures then shouldn't come as difficult for them, especially in their chemistry courses. Other sciences use significant figures, but their chemistry teachers really, really demand it. And then once you've talked about significant figures, now you have a good connection to going back and talking about, well, what then does it mean to round to the nearest whatever, to the nearest tenth, to the nearest hundred? And how would we reflect that when we were talking about significant figures? And now you're getting their wheels turning, and they might look at you like you're crazy. Why are you teaching me all this science stuff a year down the road in their chemistry class? They'll appreciate it. But we have to be deliberate and take the time to design activities for students to explore scientific notation and explore the idea of significant figures as it relates to scientific notation, as it relates to rounding. And if we do this well, then the rules of exponents might actually make a little more sense to our students, rather than just being something they really believe mathematicians just made up to make their lives more difficult. So we've talked a lot about just kind of computational things and proportional reasoning kinds of things, but we do have some pathways that still have algebra. A lot of us still have a college algebra or a college science and engineering pathway, and even some of our pathways that are designed for business majors, life science majors, maybe psychology majors, still have some sort of applied algebra or modeling with functions pathway. And so we are going to have some algebra that they have to use. So what can we do in our co-recs and also in those courses to make our students more comfortable with the algebra they need and the algebra they're learning? So some of this is starting to get repetitive. If we keep using the variables x and y And let me throw in, we keep using f when we introduce functions. Everything is f of x and y equals f of x, and equations involving y and x that we graph. We think it should be just easy and natural when things switch and it's not x and y, but it's p for profit and t for time. We make that transition easily in our minds. Our students don't necessarily see it. So why not start with things that aren't x and y? Why not start with other variables when you start talking about equations and graphs and relationships and slopes and things like that? And again, we tend to save units of measurement for those application problems after we've done all the algebra. Why not start and in every example have units of measurement and change it up? One of the things that sometimes happens in our courses, especially in our science and engineering pathway, is we flip out x for t, so that now we just have processes over time. Let's find some other applications. Talk to your science and engineering and business colleagues. What graphs are they giving them? What data are they giving them? And then let's have our students model it, or you can create the model yourself. But use some different variables, use some different units of measurement, make our students think like scientists and business professionals now, rather than when they get in those courses, when they're sophomores, juniors, and seniors. So let's talk about how we introduce the idea of rate of change. Because if you talk to any student coming out of high school or coming out of your old developmental math sequence, and you ask them, what is slope? The first thing out of their mouth is rise over run, which isn't a bad concept to have, but do they really understand what they're saying? Maybe if we ask them for more, they give us y equals mx plus b. And they might be able to remember what the m and the b actually stood for, but maybe not how to find them or calculate them. And the problem is we're starting with what I would call more abstract mathematical definitions and concepts, where most of our students are more concrete. So instead of introducing the idea of slope and graphing linear equations, let's just talk about processes. What's the input to this process? What's the output to this process? Graph it discretely with data or with points that you've sampled from an equation. And then you can start to build the more formal algebra. We also need to be more deliberate in having our students communicate with us how they're understanding things. What are they seeing on the graph? What are they seeing about the process? When you do get to the point where you introduce the idea of slope or average rate of change as input per unit output, we need to have them right. We need to have them be writing sentences in the co-req and in the gateway course about what they're seeing and what they're calculating and how they're interpreting it. A calculus for business course is not the first time they should have had to write a sentence about an average rate of change or a slope that they calculated off of a graph. Doing this, especially in the co-req, will also help them understand function notation. A lot of our students still struggle with function notation and why we use it. If we get them thinking early on, when we just talk about linear processes, early on, get them thinking about inputs and outputs, then the transition to y equals f of x or p of t for a profit function, it will make more sense. But you've got to be deliberate and you have to be patient. You have to let them write and communicate to you and to others and have a chance to correct when it doesn't make sense. Help them understand that getting things wrong and correcting them, especially when they're trying to explain what's going on, is good for their development. So now we're sneaking in those study skills and those learning skills. So another something algebraic that we tended to gloss over in our developmental sequences, but that become really important for students when they take courses outside of mathematics, are formulas. Now, a lot of our algebra books call these literal equations, but when you show them to a scientist or an economist, they just say it's a formula. So that's my first thing. Stop calling them literal equations. And if there are any authors here, quit using that term. They're formulas, and that's how our students view them. And a lot of times they are multivariable formulas, really multivariable, right? They have 3 or 4 variables running around. Now, those are not all variables that are changing continuously. Some of them are just parameters that will change discretely. But our students need to see these, and they need to see them not just as single formulas, but as systems of formulas. So just like I've said with some other things, think of a formula or a system of formulas as a model and give your students time to explore that model. What do the different variables represent? What kind of relationship is the formula expressing? What might we need to know about one piece of the formula to solve or explain something about another piece of the formula? Right? Sometimes that doesn't necessarily mean calculating something numerically, just describing as one thing increases, what's happening to the other one. As one thing decreases, what happens to the rest of the system. Give them time to explore those things and write deliberate guided questions for them to answer individually and collaboratively. One of the best examples of this I found in a physical science book. So this is a physical science class that's taken by general education students. So it's not science and engineering, probably some health professions, some social sciences. They've got a mass on a table and a mass hanging off the edge of the table, and they're connected on a pulley. And this F is kinetic friction, T is the tension in the pulley, and I've got the 2 different masses and then the acceleration of the whole system. Right? And they're asked to solve for A. Notice something. They're asked to solve for A without being given any values for anything. They think of this as a system of equations. Typically, they're going to solve for the acceleration and they're going to solve for the tension. The friction somehow is either going to be given to them or they're going to have other information by which they can calculate the friction. But typically, this system is to solve for the acceleration and the tension. And this one is set up really nicely. If they add the 2 equations together, they can get rid of the tension term, and then they can do some factoring and solve for the acceleration. They're expected to do that algebraically. Our science colleagues expect them to have the algebra skills to do this. This was something, even just solving a single formula for a variable, we've maybe spent 1 day on as an application of linear equations, and then maybe a day somewhere later in the developmental sequence when we had done some quadratics and square root equations so we can make the formula a little more complicated. We need to spend more time solving these formulas than solving equations with numbers in them. The other thing solving things with formulas in them helps our students with is understanding spreadsheets. Our students, even our students who want to go into business and accounting and finance, they are not very good at creating and manipulating formulas in spreadsheets. Working on formulas in our co-recs and then also in our gateway courses will help students with those kind of spreadsheet skills. That will carry them through their academic careers and through their careers once they're out in the workforce. Talk to a lot of people in business and industry. A lot of things are in spreadsheets. A lot of calculations are done as manipulating formulas in spreadsheets and then copying and dragging that formula through that entire column. So manipulating formulas, not being scared of abstract representations of models with multiple formulas is a skill we need to develop better and more in our students. So we've talked a lot about content. Now spend a little time on design. So I keep using this word over and over again, and I use it on purpose. Be deliberate in identifying and developing activities. Sometimes, especially with our courses, we find a textbook we like or we find a resource we like, and we just kind of use it. And we use whatever it offers. We need to be more intentional about things. Identify what are the just-in-time skills for the Gateway Math course. I think most of us are doing a very good job of that because that was the initial focus of the co-requisite concept. But what skills are needed for future courses? I've mentioned some that came off the top of my head and some that were related to some of the things y'all told me when we did the chat blast. But talk to your partner disciplines. Talk to your chemistry teachers. Talk to your physical science teachers. Talk to your engineering colleagues. Talk to your colleagues in your business and health professions programs. Find out where the weaknesses or the gaps are, especially now that students aren't in 2 and 3 course developmental sequences. And then you have to decide where are you going to put these needed skills? Because it's easy to figure out where to put the just-in-time skills. You do them right before they're covered in the Gateway Math course. Or maybe you wait after it's been presented in the Gateway Math course and you use the co-rec to explore them a little bit and practice what's needed. But where do we put these other skills that they don't necessarily need for the Gateway course explicitly, but they need later? How much do you put in the co-rec? How much do you then include also in the Gateway course? How do you sequence those things? Where do they fit with these just-in-time skills? The other thing that is going to be tough, because we all have our favorite topics, we all have those topics or objectives that we can justify we've got to cover. But be honest with yourselves. Be honest with your colleagues teaching these Gateway Math courses. What topics need to go? Some topics will need to go because they were topics that we used to have to teach, but now we don't need to because of technology. And I didn't mention a lot of technology today, but this is where you might think about it. Some topics or objectives need to go because they're just not used as much or as extensively or as immediately as you think. Right? If your answer to why is something in your Gateway course for your science and engineering majors, and your answer is, Well, in Calc 3, when we do this one thing, they need this skill. Well, guess what? If you teach it in pre-calculus or college algebra, they're not going to remember it if they haven't used it till Calc 3. So why not save it for Calc 3 when they're more mature students, they're more mature mathematically, and you can send them to go watch a video, or you can make a video for them to watch, and they'll pick it up really quickly. So this is tough to do. They're tough conversations to have. But you have to have them, and people have to have thick skin. The other thing that you might have to discuss, even if you've already kind of started your co-requisite and now you're reevaluating it. I think a lot of people are now reevaluating their co-requisite structure because of all the changes we've gone through with COVID. We got thrown online. Some of us got proctored testing taken away, and it's not coming back as quickly as we like it. And things aren't coming back on campus and face to face as quickly as we might want it to. So we're reevaluating. So who facilitates your co-requisite? Is it the person teaching the gateway course? Does every gateway section have a co-requisite section attached to it? Is it some sort of lab personnel or part-time faculty? How instructor specific are the gateway courses and the co-requisites? Do you allow instructors to change the order of topics? If you allow them to do that, what does that do to the sequence of these just-in-time skills, especially if the facilitator of the co-req is not the instructor of the gateway course itself? How do you improve and establish that kind of communication? Those are questions that are going to be asked by your advisors. Those are questions that are going to be asked by your administrators, especially when they and students start to get confused about things. So I just wanted to say something at the end here, because sometimes you hear what people think co-requisite support is, and it's very restrictive. So understand, I'm saying it can include these things, but it doesn't have to be just these things. If your co-requisite support is only just-in-time tutoring, then you're missing out opportunities to engage your students in so much more. If all you've done with your co-requisite is condensed and created a faster paced developmental sequence that's not really taught beforehand, but at the same time as your college level gateway course, then you're not giving your students time to explore other things. It can still be that. Some of us have had to do that. A lot of us have had to condense, but we need to include other things. And your co-requisite class needs to be more than just practicing skills. Kind of goes along with it. It needs to be more than just in-time tutoring. If all it is just practicing skills, then why not just throw it into whatever your learning management system is and have students practice it and get immediate feedback from that computer system? And it needs to be more. They need to develop the intuition behind those skills. They need to develop skills beyond those skills so they can apply them after the gateway math course. So these also come into play when you're thinking not just of design, but in communicating what your co-requisite support is. Because if something gets miscommunicated, if your advisors believe that your co-requisite support is just this tutoring lab where students just practice stuff to help them get ready for class, then they aren't going to take it as seriously as we need them to. And they aren't going to be looking to put students in your co-requisite support because they're not going to value it. So your communication to your advisors, to your administrators, to your admissions staff, to your registrar, to your faculty colleagues who may be questioning, well, why are you doing away with 0-level courses? My students are not going to be ready for my chemistry, for my economics class. If you explain to them, my co-requisite support is not just these things, it's more than that. That will help get support for your co-requisites across campus and maybe help you build stronger courses. Last thing, we talk about this, especially with community colleges and other open admissions colleges. Co-requisite support is not for every student. You might have students who need more. I've had some serious discussions with people in our TRIO office. They are very concerned that the number of 0-level courses we're offering decrease every semester because they think their students need them. So what do you do with students who need more or whose advisors perceive that they need more than just co-requisite support? What does that look like? Do you still keep some developmental courses? How does that work with your pathways? Instead of a developmental sequence, do you have a particular developmental course for each pathway or sets of pathways? Does it look more like self-paced work in a math lab or a tutoring center somewhere? Those are questions you have to ask because we're going to have a small percentage of students, especially at a lot of our open admissions colleges, who still are not ready for college level work, even with co-requisite support. And they still come to us expecting us to teach them something, and expecting us to give them what they need to complete a program. That's going to be a very challenging group of students. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you all very much for coming, and we'll entertain any questions.
Thank you, Chris. A lot of good information there for a lot of us could use that information. Does anyone have any questions for Chris? We didn't have any that came up during the webinar. I'm not seeing any right away. Well, if you don't have any questions, if we could give Chris a round of applause for some thanks in the chat. We will download the recording and we will post this later in the day. But Chris, thank you. And April, thank you on behalf of the National Math Summit to put this webinar together. When the recording comes out, please share it with your colleagues. This is some good information here. Okay, Chris, I'm seeing a lot of kudos, but no questions. So I think you're off the hook.
They all know it all now.
All right.
Or they did beforehand, I think.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you all for attending. If there are no questions, that's all for today. You'll have a good day.